Hi everyone, welcome to our unit on Daoism. So this is another one where we're covering a couple of different chapters into one. We have the first one on the Tao Te Ching and then the second chapter on Chuangzi, but they're both in what we, after the fact, call Daoism or classical Daoism or philosophical Daoism. And we'll talk a little bit about what all that is as we go along. So the first of these two chapters, we're talking about the Tao Te Ching. And this can be rendered in different ways, so especially when you're Googling stuff, which for this chapter you really shouldn't do, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Sometimes you'll see them as separate words, which for the content of the text actually makes a lot of sense. Jing, we've used this word before, I believe. It just means like a book, a classic text, an important, philosophical or historic work. Dao, we've seen this term before, right? It means the way, and then a lot of different meanings for that. De means virtue, and again, a lot of different meanings depending on which philosopher you're talking about. So it really means something kind of loosely like, the book of the way and virtue. It's also very common to see it in that other transliteration style, where it looks like this. And again, a lot of earlier translations used this, and so sometimes people just got into the habit, even if they're using the other transliteration system within the book, of keeping the kind of older transliteration for the title, because people would recognize it. But again, meant to be pronounced the same way, right? So this is a text. It is attributed to Lao Tzu. We'll talk about him in just a second. It's prone to all sorts of misinterpretations, despite there being so many different translations. Interestingly, like this is one of the, you'll look this up as a factoid, it's one of the most translated books in the entire world. It's just up there, like top 3, I think, last I heard. However, what's really fascinating is how many of these translations are by people who do not actually read classical Chinese. Think about that for a minute. I translated a book from a language I don't read. There's all sorts of Westerners who read, especially American and kind of British authors, who read English translations, a whole bunch of them, and then just sort of pick and choose which way they want to interpret it and put it all together and then call it a translation. At best, that's an interpretation, so that's a whole thing. But it also, again, really contributes to all sorts of weird misunderstandings. It's very metaphorical, it's very poetic. We'll talk about its use of language in a bit as well. But as a result, especially in the Western Hemisphere, a lot of weird ideas have grown up around it. And not just in the Western world, I mean all over, but especially I find in the Western world. I would bet my next paycheck, not an actual bet, but I'll just say that for rhetorical effect, that probably something like 90% of the English language stuff on the internet about Daoism and the Tao Te Ching are completely wrong and just utter nonsense. I think there's been more nonsense written about it in the English language than any other philosopher we're studying this semester. Maybe any other philosopher entirely, I'm not sure. This means this is a particularly good chapter or section, 2 chapters, to really focus on the text in the lecture. Because if you're trying to Google stuff or get ChatGPT to tell you stuff, it's going to get that 90% of the stuff out there that it sees 1,000 times and thinks is right, even though it's wrong, because there's so much garbage out there about this, all right? So some important facts, kind of historically, especially about the Tao Te Ching and Daoism in general. And here I'm working from the textbook author. I'm a philosopher, not a historian, so I'm kind of relying on him. There may be some debate about some of this stuff, but for our purposes, let's stick to the text. So this first one, I know this one is correct. Daoism did not exist in ancient China. There wasn't a movement called Daoism, or even a movement really called anything associated with the ideas. It was not an organized movement at all. Unlike Confucianism and Mohism, which did have formal schools with teachers and students, even back then, right? And even the term Daoism is a much later term. It becomes more of an organized religion based on some early philosophical texts and other things quite a bit later, and it ends up differing a great deal from that. So for example, in medieval China, which is after the classical stuff we're looking at, the religious Daoism involved a lot of like experiments with alchemy and things like that that don't appear to be present in these early philosophical texts. Right? So Daoism did not exist in ancient China. That's really an anachronistic term that we use later. And we do tend to make a distinction between classical / philosophical Daoism, which is really what's covered in these chapters, versus later religious Daoism, which goes in some very different directions, involves other texts and so forth. Right? The second important fact per our textbook is that Laozi did not exist. Now, Laozi, as the supposed author of the text, did not exist as a historical person. Don't get mad at me about that. I've had some international students yell at me about that before. Again, I'm not a historian. I'm just following the text here. This is, for some people, this could be an offensive claim, and I understand that, and I'm happy to have a discussion about it. Just don't yell at me while we have the discussion, okay? But just following the text, which is what we're doing for the purposes of this class, and you can, email the textbook author if you want to debate him about this. But we've talked about that distinction between myth and history. And remember, myth is not a negative term. I feel like actually a number of students didn't seem to quite get that based on the discussion. There is that negative use of it sometimes in conversational English. When we talk about myth, we mean stories that may or may not be true, are certainly important and have a special meaning, but that we can't really say in a sort of scientific way that they are historically accurate. And so Laozi, in that sense, was sort of a mythological figure. And this is what most modern historians think, barring further evidence, and I'm sure that that's open to discussion. He is more of a mythological figure than a historical one. We cannot historically say that he existed. Right? And there's actually good historical reason to think that he did not exist as the specific person at the specific time that the mythology claims about that. There's no reference to him in any other texts at the time. He's only mentioned much, much later. The name itself simply means old master. Remember that Z means master, Kongzi, Mongzi, right, Mozi, etc. It literally just means old master. So again, kind of more of a mythological figure. He's attributed as the author of the Tao Te Ching, but really the literary, textual, and historical evidence suggests that it's a collection of texts written by many different people over different periods of time. Supposedly, the myth goes that he was a scribe during the Zhou dynasty, and that he got into debates with Kongzi and maybe Mozi too, and of course, always portrayed as winning the debates. He supposedly left civilization to go live out in nature. He stopped at the city gates and had this conversation with a guard where he supposedly dictated the text of the Tao Te Ching, and then the guard wrote it all down. But again, this looks like historically that there's not evidence for it, and that there is historical evidence that it was written over a period of time in different chunks, different authors, which may contribute to some misunderstanding of the text because they aren't necessarily always completely coherent or compatible, consistent, I want to say. Coherence is a different issue, and we'll get to that in a bit, right? In Chinese, it's often, the book is often just referred to as the Laozi, like the Book of Laozi, and we've seen that with other texts as well, right? But again, this has become kind of a customary way to refer to it. It means something like the classic of the way and virtue. Right? The text has very little to do with common, especially American, interpretations and misinterpretations. I guarantee it. Look up stuff, and you're going to find all this stuff where it's like, Taoism is about being mellow and following your bliss, man, and taking it easy and this kind of stuff, right? And then Winnie the Pooh. There's this book called The Tao of Pooh where it's supposedly saying, Winnie the Pooh is a Taoist, and if you read Winnie the Pooh stories, do you remember those from when you were a kid? Just me and my dad. They're still around. It's a thing. And saying that Winnie the Pooh is a Taoist, but all based on this kind of misinterpretation. The Tao Te Ching has essentially nothing to do with Winnie the Pooh whatsoever. So all that stuff you need to get out of your head right away, and really avoid that stuff when trying to understand this, when trying to answer quiz questions, when trying to have discussions about it, etc. Right? As we said, it's a very enigmatic text. Some people would argue it's not even really a coherent text, but as we'll see, that might actually be part of the point. That might be intentional. It's very fractured because, again, it was probably written by a lot of different people, and it's very easy to read stuff into it to project what you want it to mean. And that's part of what contributes to all these misunderstandings about it. In the West, it tends to be overinterpreted as essentially saying the same thing as Western Romanticism. I won't spend a lot of time on that. You might have read some romantic poetry in literature classes, like Wordsworth writing poems about trees and nature and things like that. There are some similarities there, but a lot of people, if they know about Romanticism, they start reading a text and they're like, oh, this is just Romanticism, and kind of cram it into that and then miss all sorts of other things that are going on, right? So what we're going to do, per our author, is try to just actually look at the text on its own merits, kind of ignore all that static out there, and just see what it has to say without kind of forcing these other weird interpretations on it. And I really like the way the author breaks this up. He talks about it in terms of 5 major themes. So if you're following along in the text, right, he's literally got a section of 5 themes and then breaks them down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first theme is social ills and their solutions, social problems and their solutions, we might say. Right? So why not? And am I writing this down right? Yes. And their solutions. So that's number 1 here. Good. So, a lot of these misinterpretations see the Tao Te Ching as some like otherworldly text. And that's where it gets into some of that kind of, hippie, like, hey man, you got to be groovy and follow your bliss and think about these groovy transcendent things and so forth. But in fact, that's not the case. It's not, there may be some otherworldly aspects to it, but it's not just that, or even primarily that. It has an urgent practical concern that it's rooted in the various authors' contemporary problems, especially during the very chaotic Warring States period. So even, if you have your text and you're following along, there's some really nice selections here that show this. Again, I really like how well he organized this, right? So right in the very first kind of large quote there, after that header there, he's talking about some of these problems, these very obvious real-world practical problems that deal with things like, food, clothing, and shelter kinds of stuff, right? And how, there are people who are grossly wealthy while other people are kind of suffering, that kind of stuff, right? You can read that. I won't read it word for word, but there's a nice passage there that expresses some of these concerns, right? So it's very urgent practical concerns rooted in contemporary problems, contemporary to the Warring States period. It preaches peace, but not complete pacifism, and that's another misunderstanding that Taoists are pacifists. Right? And it does talk about some of that stuff. Oh yeah, just right under there, right? The very next one down. Right, and it's saying, weapons are not awesome things, but if given no choice, people will pick them up and fight if they have to. Peace is the highest ideal, but sometimes you have to pick up that sword and fight and have militaries and things like that. So it very much preaches peace, but not at all total pacifism. And it argues we can solve the problems of contemporary life by returning to a primitive agrarian utopia. That they thought that before we formed civilization, with all its complexities and industry and government, that people lived in a much more natural state. They had this kind of utopian idea of nature and human beings living in a state of nature. Kind of some references to that state of nature reasoning that we've talked about before, right? So that was really the natural human condition before civilization. But then civilization comes along and corrupts human nature and causes all sorts of problems. So really the best way to do that is to leave all that behind, go move out in the woods, build a cabin, farm, that kind of thing, right? Which apparently is what Lao Tzu was supposed to have done. And again, you kind of have some things here, top of page 126, where it's showing all the problems of civilization, all these artificial conventions like taboos and prohibitions, laws and edicts, etc., actually just make things worse. I like that last line. The more clear the laws and edicts, the more thieves and robbers, right? Crime is caused by having laws that make things illegal. So then when people break them, they're robbers and so forth, right? If we just lived in a natural state, we wouldn't have laws and then we wouldn't have crime. That's interesting. That's an interesting argument, right? We do this, a virtuous ruler of some kind might be able to help us get back there. A good ruler can help transform our way of thinking about things, right? And so it does talk, the very next quote down, right? If you really kind of have real, like, Tao-based virtue, right, you can possess the state, right? But to do that in a way that helps lead people to virtue, right? And on the topic of virtue, though, it's very critical of Confucian ideals of virtue, seeing them as artificial creations of civilization. And so again, that kind of last quote there. When the way is abandoned, there are benevolence and righteousness. Well, benevolence and righteousness are translations of a couple of those Confucian virtues. So it's saying when we abandon the true way, then we have to have these kind of second best artificial virtues that Confucius talks about, right? And all those things like references to the familial relationships or some of that differentiated caring. That whole passage there is really on 126, the third quote, is really a criticism of Confucianism, right? There's also a few things that seem to imply criticisms of Mohism as well. There's a little quote embedded in, rather than separated off, where it seems to be criticizing Mohism's emphasis on argumentation and logic, right? It says, cut off cleverness, abandon profit, a Mohist term, and robbers and thieves will be no more. Oh, and just before that, the good do not engage in disputation, argumentation. Those who engage in disputation are not good. So both of those seem to be references to and criticisms of Mohism. So Daoism, or we retroactively call that, and certainly the Tao Te Ching, seem to be direct responses to and criticisms of and an alternative to Confucianism and Mohism. Good. As we get into the next section here, non-action. This is a really important thing, and another one of those things that there's all sorts of terrible stuff online about, so please ignore it. When they talk about non-action, that is not the same thing as not acting. They're not saying sit around, do nothing. Non-action, it's maybe a weird translation. The term is wu wei, and you don't need to know that, don't write it down. But it uses like a little negator that in English kind of translates into non-action. But it doesn't literally mean not acting. Non-action is a particular way of acting. It's a non-self-conscious, but perfectly responsive to the situation way of acting. So I think he uses this example, like a professional basketball player. We are familiar with this idea of non-action. We just don't use that term for it. If you've ever watched a really great athlete play and you say they're in the zone, that's non-action, where they've trained so much that they don't have to overthink it. They're just in the moment and they're doing everything right. And if they took too much time to step back and try to think about it, they'd actually screw it up and get it, they get in their own head. They get the yips we talk about sometimes with athletes, right? So you kind of know how to do it, right? He uses the bike riding example as well. That's another one of those things, like when you're learning how to ride, you can't overthink it or you fall over, right? And also, interestingly, you can't know how to ride a bike by just thinking about it in explicit terms, like an explanation or like the physics of it. And somebody can't teach you by just explaining it. At some point, you just kind of have to do it, and you just kind of figure out how to do it without it being really verbalized in a really explicit way, right? And so this is something that comes up later in Western philosophy, where sometimes we make this distinction between knowing that on the one hand versus knowing how. And there's a difference between knowing how is just sort of being able to do it, even if you can't really verbalize it or explain it in scientific terms, right? Whereas knowing that would be more like the very explicit, I'm going to explain this, I'm going to give a scientific explanation. So a good athlete knows how to throw the ball so that it goes in the basket, but he doesn't know that it can be calculated using all sorts of math and calculus and physics and so forth. He couldn't sit down and like write out the physics equations for it. Right? The physics and math would be more the knowing that, and the knowing how is just being able to do it, right? And so non-action involves knowing how, right? That it involves knowing how rather than knowing that. Just like with the bicycle, I mean, people can kind of start to explain it, but mostly you just kind of get on it and do it until you can do it. And you absolutely would say, you know, somebody says, hey, do you know how to ride a bike? You'd say, yeah, I know how to ride a bike. Okay, write out the physics of it. No, I mean, like, I can do it, right? And I can maybe tell you a little bit to get you started, but at some point you just got to do that. And non-action is very much like that. It's the knowing how, it's not the knowing that. This has ethical relevance as well, right? So he uses the example in the book of, like, imagine that I lose my wallet and you return it to me. Right? Well, what's the explanation for why you did that? Well, the different philosophies might have different views about that. The Confucians, like Kungzi and Mengzi, would talk about it in terms of virtue. Oh, you've learned these virtues and you know it's the right thing to do. Virtues especially like benevolence, righteousness, that kind of thing, right? Whereas Yang Chu would say, well, it's all about self-interest. You gave it back because you're hoping there'll be a reward. Oh, here's $20, thank you so much. I don't have to go to the DMV now and get a new license, right? Mozo would say for the greater good because it's more beneficial. It increases profit in that utilitarian sense, right? The Lao Tzu would say all of those are wrong because they all involved more of this kind of stuff. Especially the Confucians, you have to use this wisdom to know how to apply the different virtues and figure out, hey, should I do this or not, right? Yang Chu, you're calculating self-interest. Mozi, you're calculating the greater good. But Lao Tzu would say the person who has this ideal of non-action would just pick it up and return it without even thinking about it. It would just be this natural, spontaneous, almost reflexive thing. Right? You just wouldn't think twice about it. And again, I feel like we kind of relate to this, right? I bet a lot of you do that because a lot of you are good people. That like if somebody drops something, like you don't sit around and think, I better remember what I learned in my philosophy class. Like you're just like, no, I'm just like, oh, hey, buddy, you dropped something. Here's your wallet. You help them pick it up or something like that, right? So this is really the Tao Te Ching's view of non-action as applied to ethics. If you have to think or feel in any particular way, which those other ones would say, then it's really an artificial action, and then it's not really kind of a true Taoist sort of virtue. It's certainly not non-action there. Right? And he kind of talks about this in the text a little bit. And this is where, I'm getting ahead of myself a little, sometimes people think that this is an incoherent text. And in some ways it's purposely seeming to be in order to get you to think about things a little more deeply. But at the bottom of page 128, there's a nice selection. Those of highest virtue do not strive for virtue, and therefore they have virtue. Like, wait, what? But he's using, on purpose, the word virtue in different ways. He's saying the highest virtue, the kind of virtue that the Tao Te Ching actually endorses, does not have artificial virtues like Confucius. And that's why they're able to have those natural virtues, right? The lowest virtue never stray from virtue, and so they lack it, right? That kind of thing. The highest virtue practice non-action and never act for ulterior motives. You don't have to think about it, you just do it, right? Now, to some extent, this might not be a completely fair criticism of Kongzi. I think Kongzi and Confucianism in general would also think that you should internalize virtues so that you don't have to sit around and calculate the way that Mozi or Yang Chu do. It might not be entirely fair, but even there they'd say it's different. The Daoism, the Taoist, the classical Taoist, the Tao Te Ching, would say that it's still based on an artificial virtue that you had to learn in this kind of weird way. So there's some debate about, is it really that different than Confucianism? It's still certainly different, though, from Mohism, where you absolutely do have to calculate the greatest good and that kind of thing, right? And this is where, let's see here, Mozi, if we remember, he was talking all about how leaders have to kind of lure people into doing the right thing with the right, rewards and punishments. But, again, Taoism would say that's almost more like Yang Chu at that point. You might as well just be thinking in terms of self-interest. And that actually, Lao Tzu, the figure that we attribute Lao Tzu, would say that leads people away from non-action, right? And so, there's some of that stuff, and this goes to political philosophy as well, right? That good leaders shouldn't be really heavy-handed with all sorts of laws and punishments, but just kind of be a background figure who maybe leads more by example and allows people to act more naturally, right? And so it does talk about that, that kind of last big quote on the bottom of 129, right? The greatest of rulers is but a shadowy presence, right? And then when at the end there, when you ask people, why did you do this? They're like, oh, that's just how we are naturally. And they don't realize they've been kind of led by example rather than punishments and things like that. Right? Section 3, kind of a short one that suggests what we've just been talking about. The teaching that is without words. So just a little bit about this, but Lao Tzu, again, I'm using Lao Tzu, kind of that mythological, we attribute the author Lao Tzu to the text. Seems to believe that language is also an artificial convention, that in the state of nature we would at least have much simpler ways of communicating rather than complex languages, and they reflect artificial ways of thinking about things, especially artificial ethics and politics like in Confucianism, right? And so, right, top of 130, nameless unhewn wood is but freedom from desire. Without desire and still, the world will settle itself. Right? And a little bit later, it uses this word names, but that's kind of a translation of something that might just mean words in general language, right? Right, the unhewn wood is carved up, then there are names. Now that there are names, know enough to stop, right? And so that kind of gets into the next thing. Why are names so problematic, right? Well, it kind of gets into some of these passages, but a lot of terms, this seems to be borrowing from the school of names and the different kind of paradoxes that come about through language, how different words can mean things in different contexts. They can be kind of relativistic in various ways. And remember, one sense of Tao, the way, is a linguistic account of something, especially like ethics and politics. And the Tao Te Ching suggests that the right way to use language is just as kind of a stepping stone, where you use like metaphors and poems and paradoxes to get people thinking in the right way, but at some point they have to transcend that. And that goes back to that knowing that versus knowing how. I can use some language and kind of tell you, well, here's how you get on the bike, but at some point you have to transcend that and just kind of figure out how to do it rather than knowing that it involves balancing in exactly this right sort of way, right? So a lot of the language in the Tao Te Ching is metaphorical, poetic, paradoxical, to get you thinking in the right way so that you can transcend that and move into a more kind of non-linguistic, knowing how, non-action way of approaching things. Okay, so moving on to the fourth one, this idea of the way. Just follow along in the text, very nicely organized here, right? So we talked about all the different meanings of the way, and it can literally mean just like a path, a road. It can be a linguistic account of something. It can be the right way, like an ethical system of some sort. But also the last one we talked about that didn't really feature in these other philosophies in any particular way is to think of it as kind of a metaphysical principle, right? And Daoism, and anachronistically using that word, goes beyond a lot of these other schools by focusing on and maybe even sort of inventing this fifth sense, this metaphysical sense of the Tao. And so it posits the Tao as a kind of a thing, an entity that generates and guides heaven and earth and all of the myriad creatures. However, the way is not constant, and it cannot be captured by any fixed doctrine, including even the text of the Tao Te Ching itself, or any so-called Daoism that, again, kind of goes back to the previous point, transcends language, and doctrines are going to be spelled out in terms of language. Right, so notice this paradox again of where, the Tao Te Ching is a book, it's got words in it, and it's using language, but trying to describe something that it says can't really be captured by language. And so the Tao Te Ching largely does this by way of a kind of a methodology. The Latin term that we use comes up from Western things. Via negativa. The negative way is basically what that means. So it's a way of describing something in negative terms. That is, you kind of say what something is by saying what it isn't. And so, we do that in just kind of common sense kind of ways. Sometimes when you're trying to explain something, you just distinguish it from other things that it's not. So that people say, oh, okay, not that one, this one, right? But it's done so in a way where the negativity of it is a positive thing. So it's not negative in the sense of it's a downer or it's bad. It's just negative in the sense of I'm telling you what it is by saying what it isn't. But that what it isn't is a good thing. And so, let's see, there's a quote here. On 132 towards the bottom there, where it's talking about like a wheel. Part of explaining what a wheel is explaining what it isn't, like the space in it. Like there's a hole in the center, and that's the most useful part because that's where you put the spoke through so that your carriage or your wagon or whatever can actually turn the wheel, right? And so it's nothing. It's like the donut hole, right? The hole isn't a thing, but it's kind of what makes it a donut rather than like a pastry or something. I don't know. You can have donuts without the holes. That's another philosophical debate. I don't want to get into that, right? Or for you art students, when you talk about the use of negative space, or you make a sculpture and there can be, like, say, holes and spaces in it, but that's part of the design, and it actually contributes to the beauty of the whole thing. And so it can seem to be nothing, and yet it is essential for everything to exist. There are places where sometimes it's compared to the womb, right? Like an empty space, but one that's capable of giving rise to things, nurturing things, a very useful empty space. Right? So it's nothing, but not in the sense of not existing, but in the sense of being kind of undifferentiated. It's not a particular thing. It's being prior to specifically existing things, a kind of pure potentiality that gives rise to the actual things, something that can be anything at all. And notice there's some similarities with the idea of non-action there as well, right? That it's this kind of more spontaneous, reflexive thing rather than some concrete thing that you can explain in a knowing that kind of way, right? And so the sage, the kind of ideally wise person, according to the Tao Te Ching, is one who will understand that kind of thing, right? And so the 133 you can read on your own, but there's a pretty big indented quote there that kind of talks about, being without desire and without intention actually allows you to act and to non-act in the right sort of ways. And that's kind of like how the Tao is as well. And as we saw before, how a leader is, the leader will take more of a hands-off approach and facilitate the natural goodness of things rather than trying to be too micromanagey or interactive. Right? And so then the last of the themes here, mysticism. This is another thing where we have to be very, very careful because, that got away from me. Let me start that word over. This word can mean legitimately different things in different contexts and different traditions, and it's used in a particular way here that might be a little narrower than some other ways, and also is the kind of stuff that gets into that weird hippie nonsense that you find online about Daoism. So the Tao Te Ching places a lot of emphasis on non-linguistic knowledge, right? It's knowing how rather than knowing that language is kind of artificial and insufficient, that it's a stepping stone through paradoxes, metaphors, etc. And that alone sort of qualifies the Tao Te Ching as a work of mysticism. But sticking to the textbook author's definition of mysticism, which might be less than you'd find in other traditions. So the way that the textbook author characterizes it is that mysticism, it's a kind of knowledge. Right? And you don't always hear it described that way, but it is a kind of knowledge, right? However, B, it's also a kind of knowledge that cannot adequately be expressed in words. Maybe more of that knowing how rather than knowing that. However, C, it is very important to human life in general. It has great ethical and political implications. Now, every major religion has at least some mystical strains you can find, and some of the more transcendent kind of philosophies. So like Plato, Christianity, there are Christian mystics, etc. But they can differ quite a bit on the details, like exactly what sort of knowledge it is, how one experiences it, what it's supposed to be knowledge of. They can have very different views about that. And also be very, very careful about this, because many forms of mysticism in other traditions will essentially take this idea that mystical experience involves a kind of union with the divine or the transcendent or God, or absorption into it. And that does not seem to be part of the Tao Te Ching's mysticism. But it gets interpreted in weird ways as meaning that, like you become one with the Tao or something. That doesn't actually seem to be borne out with the text. You have to think about the Tao in some sense and try to live in a way that's sort of consistent with it, but there isn't that kind of mystical union or absorption. We're going to be very careful, especially when, say, answering a test question about this, that you don't get misled, because that is very common in other forms of mysticism. And maybe even post-classical Taoism, maybe as you start getting into the more medieval religious kind of stuff, but it's not in the Tao Te Ching. So for Taoism, this mystical knowledge, it's really embodied in practical activities. They're performed in the everyday world. They actually kind of constitute the highest form of ethical activity, right? So it could be that kind of cliche, I'm going to sit around and meditate sort of stuff, but it also could be kind of mystical knowledge that's enacted in everyday tasks. Playing sports, again, right? The basketball player, the professional basketball player, has this knowledge of the sport that he can't quite put into words, but is very important for his life. It's his profession, right? So it's through action. It's not like visions or feelings or things like that. It's very immanent. It's in this world. It's not some transcendent union or absorption. But the Tao Te Ching also suggests that it's kind of a method of cultivation as well. It sort of flips the metaphors of Confucianism. Kongzi talked about like polishing jade. Mengzi talked about growing a sprout. Instead, they suggest we actually kind of simplify things, revert to our more natural, rough, raw form, the unhewn wood, the uncarved wood that we used before, right? That we not really force things, but we kind of empty our hearts, they talk about, right? And then this will help us achieve that stuff that some of the weird internet stuff picks up on, that it's kind of related to, about kind of achieving a sort of a calm, a serenity, and even-mindedness while you perform these actions. Right, so, again, the basketball player, when they're in the zone, like all that anxiety and worry kind of disappears, and they're just focusing on making the next shot, right? And that, they talk about this in terms of sometimes becoming mirror-like. The mirror doesn't have its own image, it just reflects the world around us. It's empty, but full of the many things, just like the Tao itself. And that's more like what the kind of day, the kind of virtue is that the Tao Te Ching expresses, that kind of emptiness, that stillness, that reflecting of things, the acting in a non-action kind of way, etc. So at the end of the Tao Te Ching chapter, there's a little more about the historical significance. You can read that a little on your own. I've already talked about that. And obviously, it's a text that retroactively becomes this central text in later, more explicitly religious forms of Taoism, where they do tend to treat the Tao, depending on the denomination, for lack of a better word, as something more like God, that's more similar to, say, like the Judeo-Christian notion of God, things like that, where maybe they do start to get into some of that union with the divine stuff, etc., right? But it's also very influential on other things that are going around at the time, and for that, we can move into the next chapter where we look at Chuangzi, who also, his works are classified as part of this early classical, philosophical, pre-medieval religious Taoism that they draw from. Okay, so moving on to the second part of the unit, the next chapter on Chuangzi. Marker here. And the other transliteration style that you might see, it's sometimes rendered like that. Again, that Z means master, so Master Chuang. That's why sometimes this transliteration works a little better for people. He was a real person, at least as far as reputable evidence suggests. So unlike Lao Tzu, who's a mythological figure, Chuangzi seems to be a historical figure. He was supposed to be a younger contemporary of Mengzi, though Mengzi himself didn't mention him explicitly, but as far as the different writings we have, that seems to be the case. At the time, there were some writings about his writings where people might have been mixing him up with some other philosophers too. Sometimes this was because of the way Chuangzi himself wrote, where he was kind of using other philosophical figures, but then like reinterpreting them in order to mean what he wanted them to mean. It's lumped together with Daoism, classical Daoism, because it has a lot of the same themes and is similarly critical of Confucianism and the Mohists. So when you talk about classical or so-called philosophical Daoism, you pretty much mean Dao De Jing and the writings of Chuangzi. His writings are collected into a book that's just named after him, so Chuangzi, the Book of Chuangzi. If you see, this lying around in Barnes & Noble or something, you'll see it's kind of broken into chapters. The first several sections are called the inner chapters, and those are the ones historically that we feel pretty confident he actually wrote. There's other outer chapters and miscellaneous chapters that had been attributed to him, but that later scholars think he probably didn't write, even though they are, unrelated themes, that kind of thing, right? He uses a variety of different styles. Sometimes it's stories, sometimes it's dialogues or poems. He includes himself as a character sometimes in his stories, but it doesn't mean it's autobiographical. He includes, as I said, other characters. Sometimes Confucius, Kongzi, comes up as a character in his writings, but then he's using Kongzi to say things that Kongzi probably would not have said. He's using it as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. It can be very, humorous and playful at times, but it's definitely not meant to just be kind of glib, unlike maybe some of the School of Names people. He's not arguing for the sake of arguing, right? So some major themes and ideas that we get here. One is skepticism. So Western skepticism is a theory that claims that we cannot know the truth, at least about some things and to some degree or another, and there's different degrees and breadths of skepticism. So we're kind of using a Western term, but it seems to apply at least to some of Chuangzi's writings pretty well. In classical, especially in the Warring States period of China, this skepticism would be the view that we cannot know the way. So the way is the topic, no matter which of those ways you understand the way. And so skepticism in classical China would be that we cannot know the way. And Chuangzi seems to endorse the kind of skepticism in a lot of different passages. There's a passage, I think it's on 143, where he kind of talks about this in terms of, let me make sure I'm giving you the right number there. Yeah, good, 143, there's an indented paragraph there, where he says, let's say we have a disagreement about something and we can't come to an agreement, and we're making all these different arguments, but again, no agreement. How do we know which of us is right and which of us is wrong? Well, we might have to introduce a third person to tell us, but then how do we know that third person is right or wrong? Because if he says, you're right, I could still say, well, you're both wrong and I'm right. So then we get another person, and we're never really going to get anywhere. We've got agreement or disagreement, but we can't really say that leads to right or wrong. Right? It reminds me of this overused comic XKCD. You've probably seen these. They go around as memes and such. But there's the one that people use constantly where it's like a couple people saying, man, we've got like 13 different competing standards. It's really confusing. We need to unify all these things. Great, let's come up with a standard that unifies these 13 different standards. What do you get? 14 different standards now, right? It just makes the problem worse. And it's a similar kind of argument that Chuangzi is making here, right? So the winner of a debate isn't necessarily going to be the one who's right objectively. It could just be that they're more persuasive. And, you'd like to look to some independent standard. What is that going to be? Notice for, some people, the Mohists might say that's the standard of heaven, right? The fixed standard of consequentialism. But then Chuangzi would say, how do you know they're right, rather than somebody else's view of what the fixed standard of heaven is, right? So it just gets more confusing. He appeals to dreams in a number of passages to kind of undermine our confidence in our values and beliefs. He has a pretty famous dream argument about like dreaming that he's a butterfly, but then the butterfly's dreaming that he's Chuangzi, and he's like, well, am I really like the butterfly dreaming on me right now, or am I awake and thinking that I used to have this dream that I was a butterfly? So we have experiences where even what we, like if you've ever had a really vivid dream, you're like, yep, this is real, I totally know it, and then you wake up. And that kind of undermines your confidence all of a sudden in your ability to distinguish reality from dreams, right? Having said that, Chuangzi is not really interested in this for just its own sake. He's not interested in abstract epistemology. Epistemology is just a branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. He's more like some of the ancient Hellenistic philosophers. In the Western tradition, the Hellenistic philosophers are ancient Greek philosophers, but from schools that are kind of post-Plato and Aristotle and those classic guys. So there are Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism is another school. And a lot of those philosophers thought that the point of philosophy was not to engage in abstract epistemology or whatever, but to help us have a practical way to live our lives and to relieve us of various fears and anxieties. So the classical skeptics, the classical Hellenistic skeptics, kind of thought, people worry, is there like a God, is there a heaven or a hell, and then they're worried about what might happen to them or not. They just said, man, there's all these arguments you can never really know, so relax. Just take it easy, just chill, man. And Socrates made a similar argument, though he's a little before those Hellenistics. They were inspired by him, about death. Like, we can't know what it is, so there's no reason to sit around and worry about it, right? So a little bit of skepticism can actually be very practical, help us not worry, be afraid, be anxious, that kind of thing. There is also, in other passages, a similar but still kind of different epistemology known as relativism. And again, in the West, the idea of relativism is that there is knowledge, but it's not like absolute, objective, universal knowledge. It's knowledge relative to something. And this kind of goes back to that school of names stuff, right? I mean, obviously some terms are inherently relative. Is this on the left or on the right? Depends on your perspective, right? But relativism as an epistemological theory tends to say that it applies to other things that maybe don't seem relative, but they would argue really are, right? So maybe things like true and false, or right and wrong, ethically speaking. So in ancient China, relativism would be the idea that the way is relative to one's perspective, that the way depends on one's perspective, that there isn't one sort of perfect way of doing that. So, some of this comes about from the ambiguity of language, and there's clearly some influence of the school of names there. On page 145, you can read some of this on your own in a little detail, but different words that translate as like left, right, this, that, etc., can be also have moral connotations, right and wrong, and that kind of thing. And so Chuangzi is suggesting that we know language has a lot of this relative use, and we're using language to talk about things like ethics and politics and morally right and wrong. Well, maybe that stuff is really relative too, and it's just kind of a linguistic mistake to think that there's anything more to it than that. So in that view, there are a number of passages where Chuangzi suggests that ethical evaluations of right and wrong are perspective dependent. And again, there's a lot of influence of the school of names thinkers, such as Hui Shi, that whole I left today and arrived yesterday stuff, right? Notice that doesn't mean that we have to stop using those terms. It just means we have to understand that they're relative. And this can help us kind of reduce or even eliminate our commitments to conventional ethical evaluations, that we have to realize that a lot of people in our society and our different traditions might put forward some ideas and say, this is the absolute truth, the absolute right and wrong. And this helps us back away from those things a little bit. Like, hey, maybe they don't understand. It's all relative, man, right? And so there's some, examples of that too. forget if it's in this. Yeah, it's here we go. 146. This can be kind of, it's a humorous little story about the monkey trainers, and the monkey trainers passing out food, nuts for them. And he says, you get 3 in the morning and 4 at night, and the monkeys are all angry. And he says, all right, I'll give you 4 in the morning and 3 at night, and then they're all happy. It's the same total amount, right? But they liked it that way because it was kind of relative to their perspective. And that kind of suggests, maybe that's how we can kind of deal with people, maybe how the sage or the ruler can deal with the people, kind of understanding their perspectives, presenting things in ways that are a little bit more palatable for them, that kind of thing. The next thing is detachment in society, not from society. Unlike the Daoism or even Yangchu, who we studied before, Chuang-Tzu did not advocate that we reject contemporary civilization altogether. So for him, it's not like, Lao Tzu supposedly left civilization and moved out into the woods. We continue to exist in society, but detach ourselves from it and our roles in it. We will still engage in those roles, but not be so invested in them. Right? So there's a passage on 147 where there's a little dialogue that Chuang-Tzu writes, but he uses Kongzi as a kind of a mouthpiece for Chuang-Tzu's own ideas. This is not necessarily what Kongzi would have said. But there's a duke who's really stressing out about all his work and everything. And basically Kongzi's just telling him to chill out, right? That we have got obligations based on our roles. And, we can't escape that. It's just part of modern life. But don't worry about things that are out of your control, right? So, it's like if you have a job and you've got a boss who you think has it in for you, the best you can do is to do your job and do it well. But if he's going to come up with some excuse to fire you, that's going to happen, and there's not really a lot you can do about that. So it'll happen or it won't. Don't stress out about it, right? Very similar to classical Greek Stoicism that we've mentioned once or twice before. Focus on what you can control, worry about that, but then control it so you don't have to worry, and then don't worry about the stuff you can't control, right? And again, also similar to Stoicism, the idea is that you don't need to sort of reject the world or even change it. You change yourself. This is some of that go with the flow stuff you'll see sometimes about Daoism, that you just kind of act within society without stressing out about it too much. He says in one passage we should hide in the world, kind of hide in plain sight, right? And also, recognize our own judgments about things are kind of relative. So even when we think things are good or bad, we can't really know that for sure. I can think I'm a great employee, my boss is a terrible boss, but my boss probably thinks that they're a great boss and I'm a terrible employee, and I don't know. I can go ask my wife if she'll agree with me, but maybe she's biased, so I don't really know, right? So we shouldn't withdraw from the world entirely, but we also shouldn't be too ambitious and make it a point to try to move up in the world, right? So he gives in 149, there's a passage where he talks about Huishi, right? Or has a dialogue with him, right, about this kind of thing. And sort of pointing out that a lot of the times people who are really ambitious and try to move up in the world and get all this power and influence, it often ends very poorly for them, right? Some leader that gets overthrown or whatever, right? So that's like Chuang-Tzu says, it's like the straight tree trying to grow up as fast as possible, and then it gets just sort of knocked down by the wind. And Chuang-Tzu suggests, be more like the crooked tree, just kind of do your thing. When you're a little lower and the winds go overhead or your branches are more spread out, you'll be okay, right? So, but if you're already there, that's fine too. Sometimes people find themselves being kind of, forced into these different leadership positions. Nobody else is well suited. And they're like, all right, I'll do it. If that's kind of what happens, that's fine. You could still be the president, I guess, and believe this, but maybe it's just because that's just kind of how your life went. It doesn't mean that you necessarily, like when you were a little kid, said, I'm going to be the president, and then do everything in your power to get that, right? Right, so, if you're already there, that's fine too, but just kind of be detached from that. Hey man, this is where I ended up. It's not really where I chose to be. If I end up, getting thrown out of office, that's fine too. just to kind of take that sort of more laid-back attitude about things. A little bit more about non-action as well for Chuang-Tzu. He's even more explicit, I think, in some ways than Lao Tzu is about this. And on top of page 151, there's a very famous example where he's talking about a butcher who's like kind of going through and, you know, taking these slabs of meat and chopping off the good parts and throwing away the bones and things like that. And this goes back to that knowing how versus knowing that. Like the knowing that would be having this incredible biological, anatomical information about things. But the knowing how is being able to like sit there and actually chop it. And this guy practices so much that he's like the athlete in the zone. He's just like, he's hitting it perfectly. Like he almost never even dulls his knife because he never hits bone, and he's always chopping away the best things, right? So the butcher's got that whole in the zone thing that you find with athletes, musicians, knowing how rather than knowing that. And Chuang-Tzu suggests that this involves kind of intuitively following the natural way of the world, right? That this is just kind of an example for life in general, but there is the way, and he's a little bit less into some of the metaphysical stuff in some ways than the Tao Te Ching is, but it's still kind of implicit in there that there's a natural order, and in this sense it's literally reflected in the natural anatomical order of the creature there that the guy is chopping up, and working with it rather than against it, cutting in the right places rather than trying to hammer away at the bones and things like that. So it's kind of an example for life in general, like just understand the natural order of things and work with it rather than against it. Right? Yeah, good. So we have some discussions about that too. I'll probably add some of this to the discussion stuff. Right? Jumped ahead of myself there a little bit. Good. Yeah, good. Just to kind of wrap up the chapter, and some of this is stuff that you can kind of read a little bit more on your own. But there is this question about the degree to which what Chuang-Tzu is offering is actually like a philosophical doctrine, or just a kind of philosophical therapy, you might almost say. And some of this comes about because as you read different selections from Chuang-Tzu, there seems to be some contradiction and some inconsistencies. So skepticism and relativism, they might have some things in common, but they're not the same thing. So at least the way that he sort of puts them forward, they can't both be true, but sometimes he sounds like he's advocating skepticism, other times relativism. And if this is meant to be some explicit doctrine, it seems like it would be inconsistent, right? However, a lot of people will argue that it's not really meant as a doctrine, that it's more of a kind of philosophical therapy. And this is another thing where he's kind of lumped in with classical Daoism and the Tao Te Ching, because he's sort of suggesting that doctrine would be that, you know, explicit linguistic knowing that kind of stuff, and that he's not advocating that. Like the Tao Te Ching, there's a certain knowledge that transcends that kind of stuff. So that none of the stories are meant to be taken too literally as explicit philosophical doctrines. They're just ways of getting you to think about things, kind of think outside the box and change your life, and, you know, go through life in a more detached way, to develop this skill of non-action, be in our roles without being too attached to our roles. And so that means that if that interpretation is correct, and the author seems to think so, and I think it is too, then Chuang-Tzu is actually ultimately a mystic as well. He thinks that mysticism, again, the idea there's a certain kind of knowledge, but it can't be put into words, but it's important to real life. So language is just a tool to get people to think in the right directions, and not to be taken too literally, right? And not to get too fixated on language. He talks a little bit about kind of trying to think about this stuff that's kind of like, you know, a fish in a trap, and you're like trying to get it, and it keeps wriggling away from you. Language is sort of like that as well. And again, that seems to be maybe an influence of the school of names as well, and some of their ways of playing with paradox and such. Right? And then again, that last little section there, conventional or radical, again, that's something I think you can mostly read on your own. But it is an interesting question of, you know, how different, how radically different is what Chuang-Tzu is saying. different from, say, like Confucianism. Like, would you be able to tell the difference between, without asking them, between two people acting in the world and say, oh, that guy's a Confucian, oh, that guy's a Chuangzaist, a Taoist, a classical Taoist, right? And some of the readings suggest that that Chuangza would say your behavior probably won't look any different than the Confucian, right? You're detached in society, not from society, right? You stay in society, you fulfill your roles, you're still doing all the things Confucius would say that you should do, be a good, father, be a good ruler, whatever, right? Whereas other people see him as maybe being a little bit more radical, that it would involve a fairly different way of approaching things from Confucianism or Mohism, that if you interpret this correctly, you're not really going to follow the specific Confucian virtues, that it might be a lot more like just the non-action stuff that Daoism talked about. I don't know quite what to think about that either. I think the textbook author brings up that it's a difficult issue, and especially when we're trying to sort of sort out other people's additions to his text that he himself didn't really write, and different ways of interpreting that. So who knows, right? In some ways, Chuangza in some passages he used Kongza as a character, and sometimes had Kongza sort of be a wistful Taoist, I think is the term your textbook author uses, that Kongza was somebody who really wanted to embody these sage-like, these Taoist-like principles, but just didn't have quite the personality for it, and so had to act in his own way. But that, this is probably most of us, and that what Chuangza is offering is at least some therapeutic advice about how to minimize the wistfulness of that and become more of a Taoist. So again, a lot of different interpretations. It's not clear. The internal stuff might be sort of different, but the outward behavior might be very similar, might be very different. All right, phew, that was one of the longer videos. We were going through a couple of related chapters. Get to your quiz, look at your discussion. I said this at the beginning, but man, if there's ever a unit you want to avoid just Googling stuff or seeing what chat GPT says about things, this is it, man. You're going to get a ton of garbage from that. And boy, some of the discussion responses will not be very good, unfortunately. We'll see how it goes. I have high hopes. I will be optimistic about that. All right, let me know if you have any questions, get to your work, and then we'll move on from there for the next week.